Welcome to Eugenics, Myth and Reality, which is the centrepiece of the Battle Over Life and Death strand and is supported by the Wellcome Trust. For those of you who weren't at the earlier debates in this strand, my name is Sandy Starr. I'm the producer of the strand and I work for the Progress Educational Trust. That's a charity that champions and explains and encourages debate about advances in genetics and assisted conception and embryo and stem cell research. And I'm very excited about this debate because it grapples with issues that come up a lot in my job and that have come up a lot in the battle of ideas since the festival started more than 10 years ago. And there are two main inspirations for this debate, which I'll explain briefly. The first is that it's common for critics of new developments in science and policy concerning human reproduction and genetics to call those developments eugenic, invoking the horrors of the eugenic policies and practices of the Nazis during the Second World War and of earlier eras. And it's true that the history of eugenics and the early history of genetics are in some respects closely connected, and I'm sure we'll go into that in this debate. And defenders of the developments being criticised usually respond in one of three ways. They either say, no, this development isn't eugenic, or they say, yes, this development could be characterised as eugenic, but there are different types of eugenics, and not all of them are bad. Or they say, eugenics is a historically specific term, and it's not really legitimate to use it in relation to present-day developments. I've probably used all of those arguments myself. And debate can certainly often get stuck at this point or appear inconclusive, so we wanted to grasp the nettle, as it were, and clarify what eugenics is, and equally importantly, what eugenics isn't. And the second inspiration for this debate is that we're living in very exciting times at the moment with the advent of new techniques in science and medicine that could potentially alter the human germline. And our speakers will explain exactly what that means during the course of this debate. But the point is, critics of these techniques often make it a point of their criticism that the techniques are somehow eugenic. There was a classic example of this on BBC One about a week ago. A colleague of mine debated with someone who referred to these new approaches as eugenic. So we're going to grapple with that as well. And we're fortunate to have a very distinguished panel of speakers to help us navigate these waters, each of whom is going to speak for 5 to 7 minutes. The two speakers on my right, Ellie Lee and Leslie Hall, are going to talk about eugenics principally in terms of the past, at least to begin with. And then the two speakers on my left, Ganesh Taylor and Chris Gingell, are going to talk about eugenics principally in terms of the present and the future. Then there'll be some cross-pollination of ideas. And because our speakers have such distinct and interesting perspectives on this question, I'm going to break with tradition, and I'll tell you about each of them before they speak, rather than telling you about all of them in one go. So we begin with Dr. Ellie Lee on my far right, who is Director of the Centre for Parenting Culture Studies at the University of Kent and co-author of the recent book Parenting Culture Studies. And Ellie has a particular interest in the way that people now and in the past try to shape the next generation, whether that's how they raise their children or whether that's the application of science and medicine to produce particular outcomes. So, Ellie, can you please tell us what eugenics means, or at least what it has meant in the past?
I thought I'd begin with some quotes from eugenicists, just to give a flavour of the past at least. This is Sidney Webb, the British Fabian from the early 20th century. 25% of our parents is producing 50% of the next generation. This can hardly result in anything but national deterioration, or as an alternative, in this country falling to the Irish and the Jews. Two examples from America. The first is the opinion given by 3 Supreme Court judges, Brandeis, Taft and Wendell Holmes. The principle that sustains compulsory vaccination is broad enough to cover cutting the fallopian tubes. 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. That was the same period of time, the early 20th century. And this is President Coolidge from a little later, 1921. Biological laws tell us that certain divergent peoples will not mix or blend. The Nordics propagate themselves successfully. With other races, the outcome shows deterioration on both sides. Quality of body and mind suggests that the observance of ethnic law is as great a necessity as immigration law. These extracts are taken from a paper by Thomas Leonard, an American academic economist, about whose work I am becoming increasingly excited. So if you want any references, see me after. His focus is on the significance of eugenic thinking for economic policy in the late 19th century and early 20th century in America, the Progressive Era. And he argues that 1890 to 1920 was the high watermark of what he calls biological approaches to social and economic problems. Argues Leonard, it is hard to overestimate the influence of Darwinian and eugenic ideas in this era. So his argument is that a focus on both reproduction and race as important issues for economic and social change was the dominant view of the time. In this paper and in other work, he draws attention to an important set of points about this period in history. The first is the scope of eugenic thinking. Eugenics was mainstream, he argues. It was popular to the point of faddishness, including in its influence over economic policy. He points to the variance across the political spectrum, a point made also in other historical work of the period, particularly that by Greta Jones. He calls eugenics the broadest of churches. It appealed to an extraordinary range of political ideologies, influence over thinking of pioneers of family planning in the US and England. He points to its global influence. Histories are focused on movements in the US, the UK, and Third Reich Germany. But, argues Leonard, we know that eugenic thought was commonplace everywhere, influencing scholars, writers, scientists, and policymakers in virtually all non-Catholic countries and in many others besides. There are scholarly treatments of eugenics movements in Canada, France, Japan, Russia, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Finland, Romania. By 1933, the American demographer Paul Popenoe could boast that eugenic sterilization laws obtained in jurisdictions comprising 150 million people. And Leonard also argues, which I think could be picked up on and discussed next, that it was true to say that almost all early pioneers of genetics were eugenic in their outlook. He argues that before the 1930s, Thomas Hunt Morgan was the only Mendelian geneticist to reject eugenicist ideas. So that's eugenics at its high point, when there really was eugenic thinking. And according to Leonard, inevitably, most geneticists went along with this view. And I think this does mean, from a historical perspective, there's a whole set of questions that we might want to discuss about this period in time. What gave rise to this ubiquitous view? Why was biology so much looked to as the driver for social change? And why was racial thinking so dominant? What I want to argue, though, is that was then and this is now. And I do think that the case for historical specificity is very important. And I think a big mistake is made when people use the term eugenics simply as a brush with which to tar present developments. I think it misses what was really important about that period in time and obfuscates our thinking and doesn't help us understand the present. Now, we can have a discussion about what terms we might best use to capture the problems of today's thinking. My preferred term, and it is being discussed elsewhere here this weekend, is neo-paternalism. I think our age is not a eugenic one. I think it is a neo-paternalist one. By which I mean an outlook has come to prevail where individual action and choice-making are seen as risky, and where the moral autonomy of individuals is considered in some way fraudulent or damaging to society. Now, biological language is sometimes mobilised by neo-paternalists. So, for example, we are often told that neuroscience tells us we don't really make choices. But I think it's wrong to see that as simply a rerun of biological thinking in the past. And the point that I wanted to really end on, because I assume I'm running out of time, is that when it comes to genetics and reproduction, I would actually argue that this neo-paternalist outlook is to be found most obviously in the critics of reproductive technologies and in the critics of genetics, not in those who are developing these technologies or who advocate their use. I think it's important to note, as Sandy's indicated already, that such critics actually often do use the term eugenics themselves as part of the phrase the new eugenics or consumer eugenics. They are careful to make the point that they aren't saying that today's eugenics, as they see it, is simply the same as the past. But they do accuse both those developing genetic technologies and those who use them in reproduction as being in some way eugenicist, if it only in a consumer sense or in a new sense. And this is really where my interest in the topic lies, because I think that in doing this, what's really being suggested, particularly of parents who use these techniques, for example, parents who look to PGD to address health problems in the families that they are trying to build, is that in some sense we should be suspicious or question the motivations and decisions of those parents on the grounds that even if they don't mean to, they are acting in a disableist or negative or backward manner in seeking to use these technologies to develop their families. So I actually think in conclusion that it's the accusations levelled at those who use PGD and those who develop these sorts of technologies in this way that are the real problem, rather than any rebirth of eugenics in any real sense.
Thank you, Ellie. Next, on my immediate right, we have Dr. Leslie Hall, who's a Wellcome Library Research Fellow at the Wellcome Trust and author of the book Sex, Gender and Social Change in Britain since 1880. And Leslie is the person who catalogued the archives of the British Eugenics Society for the Wellcome Library, and who wrote the chapter on eugenics in Britain for the Oxford Handbook of the History of Eugenics, so she knows whereof she speaks. So, Leslie, please tell us what eugenics has meant, at least in Britain.
Yeah, what did people actually mean when they spoke about eugenics? Because I think it tends to be discussed as if it was this monolithic and really clearly understood ideology about the fit, the unfit, good breeding, bad breeding, and this was stable over time and predictive of particular attitudes and sympathies in its adherents. In fact, there was no one monolithic eugenic agenda, either in beliefs or political implications. As Ellie has already pointed out, the idea of eugenics could be harnessed to very different positions, ranging from the ultra-right to the communist. And feminists, for example, in the suffrage movement, used it to argue for women's control over mate choice and motherhood. So it's very flexible. And the British Eugenics Society, founded in 1907, was never a large organisation. It had under 1,000 members at the highest, and it was usually a good deal less than that, although it did have a certain degree of influence because of the people who belonged to it, who were, networked into power structures. However, it was also subject to a good deal of internal wrangling, as well as undergoing significant changes in orientation and policy over time. And there are complex factors at play within the society, some which are ideological, some which are about tactics, and some which are quite clearly based on personality clashes. And we can see the fluidity of eugenics in the way it underwent quite significant adaptation to different national and regional contexts. And I would refer people to the chapters in the Oxford Handbook here, because you can just see how multifarious it became. And for many people who were talking about it, and even advocating it, it was just one item within a whole bundle of diverse modern ideas. It was very much about modernism, about reforming society and improving the health of the nation. And it goes alongside projects of infant welfare, building TB sanatoria, setting up VD clinics, introducing vaccination programs, all this kind of public health stuff. And I think there is not one fixed meaning for individuals, either in Britain or elsewhere, and it doesn't appear that there was a really clear understanding that people who were talking about it adhered to. In fact, the C.P. Blacker, who was the secretary of the Eugenics Society, said that for many people, eugenics is confused with eurythmics. And it's clear that a lot of people were not actually very clear about the difference between conditions which are strictly hereditary and congenital diseases affecting the health of nations, such as syphilis or TB, which was also assumed to be congenital at that time. And there's also, I think, going on throughout all this, a kind of popular or folk understanding of good and bad breeding, which you can trace back a lot further than Galton's formulation of the idea. And people write to the Eugenics Society, and these people, these are people with some education, and they talk about whether various non-genetic and indeed acquired conditions can be inherited, and things like the effect of maternal impressions on pregnancy. So you've still got all these really kind of folky ideas around breeding. Also, when you look at the correspondence received by the Society and also by Marie Stopes, you find there are lots of people who are worried by this concept of negative eugenics and the idea that people should not be perpetuating unfitness And this seems to have affected far less any kind of section of the population at which these ideas might have been directed, but as what you might consider the middle class worried well, people who the society and other eugenists would have considered desirable, but instead of thinking, wow, we must be having large families, which is, positive eugenics, they're very strongly influenced by these concerns that they themselves might have some lurking hereditary problem in the family. There was a slightly dotty great aunt or whatever. Also, in 1929, the British Eugenics Society was placed on a firm financial footing by a substantial bequest from an eccentric Australian sheep farmer. And this meant that it became a very attractive partner to people whose agendas overlapped it in some way. And even if they didn't actually go all the way with its ideological position, they were prepared to cosy up to it for strategic ends. And I could go on a whole riff here about the birth control movement in the 1930s being gold diggers of 1934 with the Eugenics Society, but I won't. In Britain, it's often been commented that relative to the United States, it's much more about class than race, although the Society did sponsor a race-crossing investigation in certain UK port towns which had significant mixed-race populations, which came to this which was using very kind of retro techniques of thinking about racial difference. There was a big concern around what were known as the feeble-minded, which was a blanket term covering a very wide and amorphous group of individuals suffering from a cluster of conditions which were believed at that time, not always correctly, to be hereditary. But the idea that this problem could be readily eradicated by segregation or sterilisation was severely impacted by the rise of Mendelian genetics. Because even if factors were hereditary, in most cases the causes were to do with recessive genes, and it was impossible to identify and eradicate these conditions from the population at large through preventing obviously afflicted individuals from reproducing. In fact, it may be different in the United States. In the UK, certainly by the 1920s, geneticists of the period tended to spurn the society and eugenics as a theory, as based on principles which had been outmoded by the rediscovery of Mendel and the latest developments in genetic science. Also, a lot of them had kind of broader political concerns with the extreme class bias that they perceived in the British eugenics movement. I've mentioned this whole concept of we stop the unfit from breeding. There was also some interest among British eugenists about aiding via artificial reproduction the multiplication of fit and desirable types. And the focus was on artificial insemination by donor, which fitted very neatly with a persisting and I think possibly continuing tendency when we think of things like the Nobel Prize winners' sperm bank, persisting tendency to locate eugenic value in the male and to perceive the woman merely as a vessel. And there's a whole lot of gender stuff around eugenics, which again, within the time limitations, I don't really have time. And the Society did support various initiatives about promoting AID, but in fact these were very much taken up by people who were much more interested in helping infertile couples to have babies. Those who benefited from the Society's interest in the area had rather different ultimate aims. I think it's also worth saying that the British Eugenics Society officially dissociated itself from Nazi race hygiene policies, which they regarded as pseudoscience, very early in the 1930s, and there is also very little evidence of any relationship between the eugenics movement and organised British fascism. There are a few individuals who cross over, but it's certainly not a policy thing. I think for many people in early 20th century Britain, eugenics was sort of there, but it was just one element within a much wider scientific approach to the management of society as a whole and a vision of a new order based on planning by a technocratic meritocracy. And I think possibly, we need to think of that kind of broader picture much more and how that possibly gets embodied in the welfare state after 1945. Though after 1945, it might be supposed that eugenics could no longer be discussed or promoted. But in fact, backlash was considerably delayed. The society continued to be called the Eugenics Society until 1989. And it can be argued that there were certain, as it were, crypto-eugenic influences going on well into the era of the welfare state. For example, concepts about problem families within social work. And indeed, you could say that the three-tier system of secondary education that was introduced in 1944 had certain ideas about innate ability, which is basically somewhat eugenic. So anyway, I think it was not really until the 70s that changes render these crypto-eugenic assumptions no longer respectable. And about that time, scholars begin investigating the early 20th century movements and individuals and finding this prevalence of eugenic views. And I think initially those were viewed through the racial politics of the Nazis, and I suggest that's rather a distortion of a complex and more nuanced topic.
Thank you very much. So we're going to move now more to the present, and we're now going to look not just at, Ellie's mentioned PGD, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, so previous genetic technologies whose critics have invoked eugenics, but we're going to look at new approaches that are different in that they potentially alter the human germline. And just to give some very brief context, there's two very different approaches we're referring to here. One is mitochondrial donation, to avoid the transmission of inherited mitochondrial disease from mother to child. This is the first country in the world to legislate for the use of such a technique in treatment, and the relevant law comes into force in less than 2 weeks. So it's very timely. And the other very different approach is genome editing, which has been around for a while, but a technique that emerged recently is so much more quick and efficient and cheap than previous genome editing techniques that it's making a big impact, and indeed has been used in human embryo research for the first time in China earlier this year, but only in research, not in treatment. Which brings us to Ganesh. Ganesh Taylor is a stem cell researcher at the University of Oxford at the Weatherall Institute of Molecular Medicine, and spoke at a Battle of Ideas debate I chaired a few years ago called Banning the Brave New World, when it was by no means certain that mitochondrial donation would be permitted, and when genome editing was only just beginning to have a big impact on research. So we're very glad to have you back, Ganesh. Could you please just explain for us in lay-friendly terms what the germline is and how and why the advances I've just alluded to might affect it?
Right. So the germline is essentially a group of cells that live in your body. Females have eggs, males have sperm, and what's special about these cells is they are what come together when you make a child, essentially, and they carry the genetic material that you pass on to your offspring. It is the first collection of cells, one of the first collections of cells that's set aside during embryonic development, so they're very protected. And essentially they contain together two sets of instructions to make you. Every single cell in your body has the instructions to make you, but only your germline is able to pass that on, and it only passes on half of it. Knowing that, and knowing things like, for example, that eggs, I assume that you have a basic level of biology, you understand that eggs are somewhat larger than sperm, and they essentially carry these things called mitochondria, which are like the power packs, they're called. They sort of allow the early embryo to sort of form and have energy to do what it must do. And as Sandy indicated, there are certain disorders that occur in humans when the DNA in these mitochondria is faulty. So recent technologies has allowed us to essentially, will be allowing us to essentially eradicate these disorders by essentially taking an egg from a healthy woman and taking an egg from an unhealthy woman who carries this genetic disorder in her mitochondrial DNA, removing the nucleus, which contains the genetic material that actually mostly goes towards the sort of the genes that make the child, essentially, and replacing the nucleus in the healthy egg, therefore removing the genetic material that contributes all the sort of classic features that we associate with parenthood, eye colour, height, all those sorts of classic things. And you basically take the DNA out and pop it into the new egg, therefore removing that. Of course, this is particularly important because that child, when that child grows up, if it's a female, will then pass on the mitochondria of the donor mother, essentially. And it represents the first time in the human race, in our evolution, where we've been able to essentially allow heritable modifications of our germline. And yes, apart from the fact that I personally think that that's a really good thing, it comes at a time, as Sandy said as well, when we now increasingly are able to do things like in vitro fertilization, where we take the eggs out of the body and are able to sort of screen which embryos are in fact implanted. And in my line of work, we've started using this CRISPR-Cas9 technology, as it's called. There's a lot of jargon in this field, obviously. What you need to know about this technology is it essentially functions like a set of post-it notes and some scissors in a series of instruction manuals. So you have to bear in mind your genetic makeup, your genetic instructions on your DNA is like a set of instructions, literally like manuals. And using this technology essentially functions like scientists determining where you're going to put a post-it note, and then a molecular pair of scissors going to that page and cutting out the section of interest, which, say, for example, has a faulty instruction in it. And then we're able to either produce a sort of a replacement page, if you want to think of it that way, or just simply remove it entirely, or remove it, replace it, whatever you want to do. So that's a very, very simple way of looking at it. And what I need to emphasize here is this is very important. As Sandy said, it's incredibly new. The newest one of these technologies actually is about to be in print next week. And they are incredibly fast now. That's the take-home message from this. In the space of a week, you can go from taking a cell that has one set of instructions within it to having a completely different set, if you want it to, as directed by the scientists who are doing the procedures upon it. And that basically altogether creates an environment where we, as the human species, have access to our germline, are able to start actually thinking about what we wish to pass on to our children, and more importantly, now have the tools to really start doing that, not just in terms of mitochondrial replacement, but in terms of actual genetic material. And the important thing here is it will then be heritable. That child is effectively then modified. Yeah, so that's sort of the brief introduction to that, the overview.
Thanks. So a lot to unpick there, a lot of jargon. Mitochondrial donation, one thing, about to be used in treatment for the first time. Genome editing, something different, currently only being used in research, not in treatment. Yeah. CRISPR-Cas9, the technique, the genome editing technique that has really revolutionised it, and there are others on the horizon. And this brings us to Dr. Chris Gyngell, who's a research fellow at the Oxford Uhuru Centre for Practical Ethics, and he's doing European Union-funded research into the ethics of this whole area we're discussing. And Chris is a member of the steering committee of the Hingston Group. That's an international consortium of researchers which recently issued a widely reported statement on genome editing and on changing the human germline, both in research and hypothetically in treatment. So, Chris, hopefully you can tell us in 5 to 7 minutes, are these new approaches in any sense eugenic? And eugenic or not? Are they ethical?
Okay, great. I want to, first of all, just thank Sandy for organising this panel. For someone who writes a lot about the ethics of reproductive technologies, I always read about eugenics and always read it in completely different ways. It's used to mean different things to different people, and I really think it's helpful to sort of unpack these. So I think when we consider whether these new technologies and using them will be eugenic, we need to get clear on an interpretation of eugenics. Now, what I think is a very narrow, specific interpretation of the early eugenics movement has something to do with their view of heredity. So they had this idea that there was an ideal human heredity, that you could perfect our genes and our genomes, and that would be good for all people, you know, through all, regardless of circumstances. So I think now that sort of view that there is a perfect gene or a perfect genome is a myth. We know that some genes are good in some circumstances and some genes are good in other circumstances, depending on the environment. So I don't see these new technologies as a sort of a narrowly eugenic like that, because they're not trying to perfect heredity. What they're trying to do is improve people's lives and trying to help them avoid disease. And I think that's a sort of good distinction to make when we consider these. Now, another really distinctive thing that I thought about the early eugenics movement is the sort of means that they were trying to achieve their aims. So as sort of Leslie sort of discussed, a lot of the methods they were trying to use would be sort of sterilisation, and basically they were trying to control people's reproductive choices. They were trying to discourage people deemed to have bad genes from reproducing and trying to encourage people that they thought had good genes from reproducing. So underlying this sort of idea is that we want to interfere with people's reproductive choices to make sure they make the choices that we think is good or we think is bad. Now, as someone that do ethics, that is now just considered such an unethical sort of thing to achieve any aim. The right to reproduction is seen as a fundamental human right. Which is agreed by many sort of different ethical traditions. You should not be sort of interfering coercively in people's reproductive choices. But when we consider these new technologies, MRT, PGD, they're not about really coercing people into make decisions. Rather, they're giving people more information to make their own decisions about it. So through PGD, people can find out if their children might be predisposed to serious genetic decisions, and then they can make their own choice. So again, when we're considering the ethics of these technologies, that is another very important distinction to make about how these technologies work. I will now just touch on whether we think editing the germline might be unethical, regardless of whether it's transgenic. And it seems clear that germline, just changing the human germline, can't be intrinsically morally wrong because it happens all the time. Every time you have a child, they're going to have random germline mutations in it. Okay. Also, various practices that we might engage in increase the number of random mutations in our germline. So we know now that if you delay parenthood as a father, you're going to pass on more random germline mutations to your prospective children. But we don't see this as a really strong ethical concern. We don't put constraints on elderly fathers having children. So I think it's not intrinsically sort of morally wrong. So what we then need to decide then is, well, how should we use these technologies? How should we edit the germline? I think given that there are millions of people that are born with some form of genetic disease around the world, if we were using these technologies to sort of reduce that disease burden, I think that would be a very ethical use of these technologies. A slightly more controversial one might be that we're all born with these predispositions to sort of chronic diseases like diabetes and like cancer. But we all know some people that live very healthily into their 80s, into their 90s, that seem to flourish into old age. And, I think the world would be a better place if we all were like that, if we could all live to our full potential. And I think these technologies one day might be able to sort of achieve that world. So in that sense, if we use them in that way, it will be ethical as well. And that's...
That's absolutely a fine place to stop. Thank you. So we have a lot on the table, the past, the future, and already some cross-pollination. But before I ask the speakers to respond to one another, I'd like to take things up a notch and take some questions from you, the audience, just to see what you make of what you've just heard.
You've all talked about disease quite a bit, and I understand and certainly wouldn't want to restrict investigations into the technology of our own genes and our own selves and look for ways to avoid disease. But we haven't touched really upon anything about the most common chromosomal abnormality, which is DS. Now, we do have a level of eugenics in society around Down syndrome already, where we have screening of more than 90% of pregnancies which involve Down syndrome, which are then terminated afterwards. Now, it's certainly not something I would wish to oppose in terms of a woman's right to choose or anything like that, but I think what we do have is a separation between understanding the technology and actually having an active debate in society around the best ways to use that technology.
And the interesting thing there, I mean, obviously we can discuss whether it's right or wrong, what's done in relation to Down syndrome, but your statement, we have a level of eugenics around Down syndrome already. Whether that is true or whether we think that's the case is a separate question from whether we think it's right or wrong, and we need to be examining both of them in this debate. Could we come down here, please?
It's very interesting to hear that historical context, because it appears to me that the lesson from eugenics is that a scientific principle and scientific knowledge was abused towards a political end. Really, that's what I get away from it, and I don't think we're so different from 80 years ago. We're certainly not biologically different. So I almost feel like the interesting question is, what are we going to do? What ethical questions are we going to ask ourselves when somebody does unethically apply those technological and scientific principles we already know? Because I think that's going to happen.
Jenny Cunningham, I'm a paediatrician. I suppose one of the biggest fears that people express about the modern genetics, if you like, is that the more we know about genetics, the more complex it becomes. So that even very common conditions seem to have a very, very wide pool. They're very, very complex inheritance, very, very complex picture. And I suppose the fear that a lot of people voice is that how can you deal with such complexity? In actual fact, something like Down syndrome presents a much more simple picture, if you like. It's a fairly straightforward problem, which is, therefore more easily understood, more easily dealt with, whether, from a medical point of view, not from an ethical point of view necessarily. So I just wondered what the panel thought about some of these debates. If you think about, things like heart disease, some of the developmental problems like autism and so forth, I think it does raise some difficulties, if you like, in people comprehending what science is capable of now, and therefore what sort of questions we'll have to deal with at an ethical.
Hi, I'm Richard. I'm a sort of randomised collection of genes. This may be a bit early in this debate to sort of project this forward, but I'm taking very much this idea that we are on the cusp now of being able to modify the germline in a hereditable way so that the changes will be heritable. If that's true, the fact that they're heritable doesn't mean that they will then necessarily be inherited further down the line, because manifestly the next generation can equally modify their own germline. So immediately we're in a situation where every generation can potentially modify the genetics which it is passing on into the next generation. And although this is very early in the debate, we haven't even got to step one of that yet, but very early in the debate, it seems to me that we are throwing up ethical issues for our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, which will be exponentially different to ones even that we're facing today. And I just wonder what's going to happen 50 years down the line.
I'll come back to the panel. I might start with you, Ellie, whether you're still of the opinion that eugenics is not the right word, even to criticise these techniques if you want to.
I don't think it is really. I mean, on the point about Downs, I mean, there's various discussions that you can have about the current organisation of antenatal screening and abortion services, and there's discussions to be had about information provision and what goes on. But I think it's just completely wrong to use the term eugenics to describe the system, and I don't kind of really know why you would, unless you wanted to make it seem as if it's really awful. If you want to say that you don't like it and you don't think that women should be screening their pregnancies antenatally, and you don't think women should be having it, you can have that discussion. But I think this is, to me, it just makes no sense. If you know anything about history, it really makes no sense at all to call this eugenics. It's got nothing to do with eugenics. And I actually think it's one of the things I find really objectionable about it is that the more you find out about, well, there's lots of very interesting things about the second half of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, and there's all sorts of, Leslie's talk's absolutely fascinating, and there's lots of really interesting things to understand, but there is, some of the consequences of all of this were really, really shockingly, cataclysmically awful to a level of awfulness which I think simply should not be relativised. You know, and I think it is a huge, huge, dangerous mistake to relativise this period in history. And, you know, I mean, I think it's wrong if you're interested in history to read things backwards and to, you know, misappropriate terminology. But I think it's just a really serious mistake. So that's on that.
Okay.
Can I just say something
Quickly.
really brief on this idea about whether it was all about the abuse of science to political ends? I think that's wrong too, because I think what science was then and what science is now really don't bear very much relationship to each other. So it wasn't like, I mean, obviously there was Darwin and that was a huge breakthrough, but a lot of the things that were said and thought and that were called scientific theories, I mean, they're actually really unscientific.
It's like science fiction.
Yeah.
I mean, in some ways you can see eugenics as being a kind of science fiction which got out into the real world because it was actually based very largely on enormous preconceptions about which were just wrong. Yes, I mean the whole assumption that you could tell what was fitness and unfitness, and it was all about breeding, and that moral qualities were inherited, all this kind of thing. It was just, you know, based on the most extraordinarily simplistic notions.
But can I just put, perhaps play devil's advocate? But Darwin's cousin Francis Galton, who obviously coined the term eugenics.
Science fiction.
Well, by some measure, and in many people's estimation, and in some respects, perhaps in limited respects, he was a great and pioneering scientist without whom we would not have the genetics that ultimately disproved the tenet that there's a biological basis for race. So that's not quite right either, is it, what you're saying?
There is some way in which ideas about science, once they get into the kind of public domain, are kind of undergo mutation almost for political and social ends. The other thing that sort of struck me was this idea of you know, genetic engineering and what you know, what you're going to kind of breed for and not, you know, kind of intervene about. And I can't help thinking about these committed eugenists of the interwar period who are saying, short sight, we really need to get rid of that. There is one quite eminent person who is a member of the Eugenics Society who says, there was somebody asked me to be a eugenic father by artificial insemination, but because I'm such a four-eyed, myopic person, I thought I was not a fit person to do this. So what people think of as desirable and undesirable are very kind of contingent upon quite often very specific concerns of a specific cultural framework. So I think we do need to think through about what people think of as what we should be controlling for.
You wanted to jump in. All right, quickly,
really
Ellie. Quickly, Ellie.
It's just a really tiny point, because I just wanted to say that my argument isn't that because there isn't eugenics now, everything's absolutely brilliant. I think that there's plenty of pseudoscience around, and in fact, a lot of my own writing is about what I call scientism and its influence in very, very problematic ways over the development of social policy, and particularly family policy. But I don't think it's got very much to do with science. I think it's a different phenomenon, and I don't think it's eugenics either.
You wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I did actually. The point was made about science fiction, and I'm just going to put it out there that I think that it's a really important part of science to get put out there into the public domain and to see where human imagination can take it, actually. Because that to me, that's what this debate is about. It's to do with what do we as a human species envisage for our future? Because whether we like it or not, the science has allowed us, the imagination of scientists has brought us to a place where now we can actually start doing things that were previously inconceivable. And it is sort of taking the ultimate question into our hands. Like, we will have the tools to determine our future. But as Jenny and Richard pointed out here, I mean, Jenny, the first thing here is, and it relates to what I just said about science fiction, I mean, you're completely right. A lot of these things that we talk about, this idea that we'll be able to eradicate cancer or be able to eradicate heart disease, a lot of these things are incredibly complicated on a biological level. These aren't things that we can just take a single embryo, cut one bit of the sort of DNA out and be like, right, well, that's a job well done there. So there's a lot of work to be done yet. But the debate that we're having now is it even worth doing that? Is it worth researching this stuff? Because to research it is to then use it, essentially, or then have to have the debate in the future as to whether or not to use it. And once you have the capacity to do something good, then, or potentially good, it becomes a lot more challenging to sort of negotiate a backpedaling action of saying, oh, actually, we've changed our minds, we don't want to do this. And Richard's point about sort of the modifications being able to happen in the future again and again is absolutely true. So one of the sort of points that gets brought up a fair bit when discussing this is somehow this idea that everybody will end up looking the same because culturally we all like certain types of things, and now we are treading carefully on thin ice. But, people are naturally very varied. If every one of us went away and drew what our perfect child would look like, they wouldn't look the same. They just wouldn't. And the truth is, when that child, as you pointed out very rightly, were to grow up, their culture, their sort of socio-political background is going to be very different to ours, and what they choose to do with their children is going to be different again. And it all sort of relates back to the point that was made by us here, actually, about parenting, I think. When a lady is pregnant, it's generally accepted that she doesn't drink and she won't smoke, and it's all things to do with what you can do to best ensure your child has got gets off to a flying start. And what we can do potentially is becoming greater, and we need to start thinking about where does the influence of parenting really begin. I mean, it already does begin at that point, and we know as much, but it's more conscious somehow, and people are very uncomfortable about this activeness of the parenting that will be required by using these technologies.
Just before I bring you in, can I clarify something with you, Ganesh? Because Leslie mentioned the comedically outdated notion of maternal impressions on pregnancy, which of course is making something of a comeback. Now, we discussed epigenetics earlier today, and there's two separate things. There's real epigenetics and there's the way people talk about it and the way they raise it. But be that as it may, if it's true, and it's contested, that there are transgenerational epigenetic effects, in other words, that one person's behaviour will alter the pattern of gene expression in their offspring, is that germline alteration, deliberate or otherwise, or is it not?
I'm not a total world expert on this. I'm going to disclaim that to begin with. But yes, some epigenetic modifications can be inherited. There is a process in which when the embryo is fertilised, where epigenetics, for those of you who weren't in the debate earlier, is a cell's way of essentially determining importance of a set of instruction manuals. I said we have a lot of instructions in all of our cells. All of your cells contain all 23 manuals to make you. All of the genes that make you are in all of these cells. So rather than having all of those instruction manuals effectively on your sofa and open and ready to use, cells have different functions, right? So they require using different genes. So the cells in your eyes don't need the same functions that the cells in your gut do, for example. And the cell's way of dealing with that is essentially by labeling certain types of DNA, packaging them away, and putting them effectively on a bookshelf, or moving them over onto the coffee table so they're not sort of immediately there. And that's sort of a broad way of thinking about epigenetics. It doesn't actually change the DNA. It's a change in sort of status of accessibility and therefore usability of those genetic codes by the cell, right?
Yep.
So, yes, when an embryo is fertile, when an egg and a sperm come together, these sort of epigenetic modifications are meant to be completely eradicated, effectively taking all the genetic material back off the bookshelf, off the coffee table, putting it all on the sofa again and going, right, we're starting with a blank slate. But it's never quite that neat and tidy.
No.
And there are studies to suggest that the behaviour of mothers in particular will affect their offspring, basically.
So just before I bring you in, Chris, the interesting question, if this is the case, the epigenetic studies are contested, but obviously there's a lot of health advice now is justified in terms of telling people, but mothers, to behave in a certain way while pregnant, or even at other times, or indeed in order to ensure an ideal epigenetic outcome for their offspring, not to harm the health of their child via epigenetics. Is that so different from what gets characterised as new and novel and potentially eugenic? The health advice being put out by public health authorities.
Look, I mean, I don't think it is that different. And I mean, I think sometimes we get this conception that our genes are just so this special, powerful sort of thing that have these, wide powers. But realise that environmental influences and other epigenetic influences, they can affect other traits and our character traits, in just as important ways, and even in heritable ways. We can, the conditions that we raise our children in, can make heritable effects. But what I actually wanted to get back to was one of the points. This point about diversity, and I thought, Ganesh made a really good point there that, if you got everyone to draw their perfect chart, you'd have this wide sort of space. But I think there are some things that people might want which could sort of run these sort of risks. So I think most people want happy children. Most people want a happy, good children. If you've got this wide power over your genes, not many people would pick to have a child that's predisposed to depression or even, something that might make their life harder, like autism. But there's this sort of idea that maybe cognitive diversity and diversity in these things actually benefits us all. So they know from sort of doing studies about what makes groups of people good at solving problems. And it's not just having lots of really smart people. It's having lots of different people with different sort of cognitive traits being able to work together. So I think, this is obviously a far-out risk, but one risk of giving parents this wide capability to influence all of the traits of their children is that they might pick quite happy, nice children that aren't predisposed to these things that actually make our society richer and our sort of life. But I wasn't saying you were saying.
No, I was going to say, actually,
quickly.
Even if that was the case, we start from a point of large diversity already, so that the effect of sort of convergence is going to be still limited by the range that we have to begin with. And let's not forget, those sorts of happy qualities can be also brought about by random mutations if we want to look at it from a genetic point of view, but also they're circumstantial as well. There will never be a place where everyone is completely happy, even if their genes tell them they should always be completely happy.
Right. Okay, audience.
I just would like to think that the level of education about these issues, both genetic, biological issues within our schools, I don't think is sufficient to allow the general population to have an informed discussion and understanding of what's going on. And I think a lot of that also relates to Darwinism and this thing of natural selection. Again, I think that's poorly understood in the general population, along with the concept of race, which is completely spurious, which you've all adhered to today. But if you speak about race externally to the normal public, they accept it as a fact, which isn't really true. So I'll be interested to hear your views on what changes are needed in the education of the population to ensure that we arrive at a sensible position.
Hello, my name is Gert, and I'm struggling to grab my head around this. My question is about the ethical implications for the very long-run future here, because I'm listening to the history here, and I'm seeing how fitness used to be the objective where eugenics became relevant, and now I hear your parts about happiness, for instance, and how we could eradicate depression, but also that then might hamper our problem-solving capabilities. So based on what kind of outlook of the purpose of human life we take, we end up at different conclusions about what the objective or what our ethical stance would be on any particular measure. So I would say to get somewhere here and to answer these incredibly complicated questions with huge implications, we'd first all have to agree together on the meaning and the purpose of life as a human species.
We have been trying this morning. We did start off with that question.
All right, I missed that. So then my idea was, Nick Bostrom, a philosopher from the Oxford Future of Humanity Institute, says we should speed up and become more intelligent so we can solve these kinds of questions. I think it's ludicrous to think we can, and then perhaps we should just accept that we shouldn't and stop your research. You might have to find another job than in the lab and stop it altogether.
Yes, my name is Kevin Newell, and my question is connected to that because whereas happiness is something that's very external and externally, you're absolutely right. It doesn't come from within, even no matter what they say. Intelligence isn't. And there is, and that's the elephant in the room here. It's, intelligence is a good trait. I don't think anybody would want a stupid child. Nobody's going to sort of go out of their way. Is there a physical possibility? I would have thought it was a very, very complex thing to do because you're dealing with the brain, which is... But is that someplace we should go? Or should we, as this gentleman says, not even go down that path? It is something that connects the older eugenics as well. As that was a great issue that they tried to resolve in the 1920s and with the Eugenics Society. Intelligence was up there. And I just wonder whether A, it's possible, and B, desirable.
Kerry Dingle from World Bites and World Right stuck behind the camera here. Firstly, I'm really excited from what you're saying and what the panel's saying about the possibilities of curing so many diseases and horrors. And it seems a million miles away from everything that eugenics was all about, as our speakers have informed us. There's no racial nature to it, in my thinking. It sounds incredibly exciting what we could wipe out. But my worry is a different worry, and I think maybe this fits with what Ellie is saying, is we know that, with there's broader environmental factors, what they're often saying is they mean parents who do things that are disapproved of, smoke, drink, and have a life, for example. I don't know how most of us have ever survived, given our earlier generations and parents all did those apparently evil things. So I don't know how we've got a brain. So it's either blame parents, but now the problem seems to be we couldn't trust the parents to make these future-orientated decisions. Well, why not? And I think it seems to me that that's the problem. And are scientists actually going along with this demonisation of parents?
Okay.
Hi, I'm Adam. I'm a parent. Quick question aimed at Ganesh mainly. How long before germline editing makes its way onto the black market?
Barry, I'd like to ask Ganesh if an embryo could be genetically modified so that the mother could smoke and drink as much as she liked.
My name's Thor. Given that physical attractiveness is so important in our society, and a lot of happiness is, whether you like it or not, going to be based on it, and also given that we pretty much quantified it, contrary to some of the romantic notions people have, what exactly is wrong with choosing physical attractiveness for our children?
I'm going to let the panel come in quickly. I'll start with you, Ganesh, you had a couple thrown at you. On smoking and drinking, etc., the one transgenerational epigenetic effect you never hear people talk about at the Department of Health is the one that might make you be able to smoke and drink with fewer ill health effects. Somehow we don't seem to be transmitting that to our children. So please, Ganesh.
So I'm gonna work backwards there. Thought attractiveness. Actually, there's a really important part of mate selection that is based on attractiveness that will always occur, basically, and people, whether they like it or not, you're already kind of choosing the best for your child based on how attractive you find your partner. No one really looks at their husband and goes, "Oh my God." I mean, I hope not. Anyway, I wouldn't know. Barry, about being able to engineer embryos so that parents can do what they like. I don't have a crystal ball just yet. I'd like to say yes, absolutely. Again, relevance to what Jenny, the paediatrician, said and what I replied to her, these things are very complicated. I'm not going to even try and put a yes-no answer on that one, but in the ideal world, maybe one day if we get there, why not? Adam, germline editing on the black market, that is a really, really good question, and very pertinent question, something that people are really thinking about at the moment, especially following what happened in China at the start of the year with the editing of the human embryo. I'm going to be honest with you, in my opinion, I think it depends a lot on how we actually choose to grapple with this technology. If it's actually dealt with and really brought into the public eye and we have measures put in place, then I think it won't drive it so much underground, hopefully. But the problem is this technology can be done by anybody with basic molecular biology tools. It isn't rocket science. I'm not saying that anybody could do it like at the drop of a hat, don't get me wrong, but it really doesn't take much to be able to do that. I don't want to scare everybody, but this summer we had a bunch of 18-year-olds in our lab engineering salts for fish, and they were able to sort of make those sorts of heritable modifications in fish, at least, in a matter of weeks. So there's this side which is probably quite terrifying to people, but it's not that. I think that's something that we really need to decide upon. It's a very valid point. I hope not. But, there's always a dark side to everything. And even if we decide, yes, genome engineering should be allowed in the germline, but only for these and these sorts of qualities, there will most likely always be people who say, oh, well, we'll just take this into our own hands. And
I'll point out the Chinese team weren't cowboys. They concluded very responsibly this is nowhere near ready to be used in treatment.
Yes. Yeah, I just a small point. Just when I was discussing this with some of the other scientists at the Hinkston group, and some of the consensus there was that, well, it's probably already happening. It's easy enough, it's cheap enough. They thought there are probably already labs trying to engineer human embryos without, regulation. So potentially it's already happening, and potentially you'll see it on the black market very, very soon.
Actually, on that note, that leads me to Kerry's point about scientists demonising parents. Scientists are people too. So I can't speak on behalf of all of them by any stretch of the imagination, but something that really needs to be addressed actually in this is just related to what we've just said here, is that when you're working in a research lab doing these things, you're quite far removed from society and what people are talking about and thinking about, and you can see how issues like this sort of, oh, I'll just give it a go, might happen, basically. And also to do with this, who makes the decisions, Kerry? I absolutely agree. Like I've said already, I think parenthood is, by the point at which you've chosen to have a child, that's when your responsibilities sort of begin. But I don't like the idea that, and this is where the eugenics thing comes in, I think, from my understanding, there's this idea that someone on high in the state is going to be saying, right, well, all children have to have this, or everybody has to do that. And I don't see that is my point of view of how this technology should be used. Essentially, it will always, at least in my worldview of how these things should be used, it will be personal choice.
Okay, please.
Yeah, I'm just thinking here that actually personal choice is very mediated by societal attitudes. As I said, there were these people in the 1920s and 30s who hear about eugenics and think, oh my God, should we be breeding? So there is this kind of pervasive sense of, what people do, which is not necessarily from on high, but is coming at them from a lot of different miasmatic areas. And the other thing that's been coming up through me through these more recent questions is, and this is perhaps me more as a science fiction reader than as a historian, the idea that if you choose certain qualities to select for, however means you do it, you may be losing something that's actually really important as well. There are kind of unintended consequences. And a novel I really like here is Naomi Mitchison's Solution 3. Naomi Mitchison was the sister of the geneticist J.B.S. Haldane. She was a friend of Jim Watson, who the book is actually dedicated to. And it is actually, among other things, it's neither utopian nor dystopian. It's set in the future, and you could say it's either or both. But it is very much thinking about those consequences of, if you've selected for certain desirable characteristics in your genetic engineering, have you, by doing that, it's specifically in this context, it's actually with agriculture and the selective breeding of food plants, and they have actually lost resistance to various pests. So, there are those questions as well.
Ellie, please.
I don't know whether I'm picking an argument with Ganesh or not, probably, I think. I mean, the materials that I spend my time analysing in the job that I do as a sociologist, spend a lot of time looking at the way various agencies want to communicate messages to prospective parents and parents, particularly mothers, about how other people think they should be living and what they should be doing. And I can absolutely tell you without a shadow of a doubt, this world of advice giving and discussion is full of doctors and scientists who really like nothing better than issuing pregnant women or even pre-pregnant women and mothers with warnings about the terrible things that will happen if they do or don't do various things. and as far as I'm concerned, are really overstepping anything that I consider reasonable. People from the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health, Jenny may attest to this, seem to really, really love doing this. I think it's a really big problem. I mean, I think they're neo-paternalists. I mean, I'm not saying that the entire medical profession and all science, I mean, by no means, but this has become a really kind of normal thing for people to do, and I think that this is a problem. You know, the is does not lead to the ought. And to be honest, a lot of the is. So, for example, if you look at the discussion around drinking in pregnancy, I mean, you assert as if it's completely unproblematic, or we all think, you know, that no woman should drink when she's pregnant. Well, there actually isn't any reason to say that. So, you know, it's not even really an is, which has immediately turned into an ought, and this is what I think is a big problem. I mean, where I start is with the need to have a much, much stronger defence and do something about the continuous onslaught that we now have against the moral autonomy of individuals, and in particular the moral autonomy of pregnant women, on the grounds that, well, now they're not one person, they're two, so we can say what we damn well like to them. And I actually think that pregnant women are still people. They are still individuals who have rights. And just because they're pregnant doesn't mean that you can say all manner of things to them about how they should live their lives. If genetic science can help them, that's brilliant. That's the end of it, right?
Okay, Ganesh, you will get a chance to respond. Some quick can we start right at the back this time?
Peter D. Williams, Executive Officer of Right to Life. So I'll accept the criticism that to call things eugenics can sometimes be a kind of ahistorical, rhetorical violation of Godwin's law, or a sort of prescriptive understanding of Godwin's law. I think it might be helpful to use the distinction between the formal and the material. You know, there can be formal eugenics and material eugenics. So if we understand formal eugenics as the historical, morally and practically discredited sort of grand project of improving the human species through, in many cases, weeding out those who are genetically flawed. Perhaps we can understand material genetics, material eugenics, as the effect of through mitochondrial donation, the possibility of genetic modification, and even the proposed use of cell-free DNA testing in the fetal anomaly screening program that the National Screening Committee has just come out with. That we're discriminating against, for example, the disabled and unborn children per se. That could be material eugenics. We're clearly willing to instrumentalise unborn human beings in order to suit their parents. That's clearly what's been discussed here very much, even unto their destruction in many cases and related ethical subjects. So whether you find any of this objectionable, the material eugenic effect of this instrumentalisation is surely contingent upon your view of the moral status of the unborn human being. If you believe in the equality of all human beings, born and unborn, then you will believe this is a violation of human dignity and the right to life, and if you don't, then you won't, and you'll see it as a sort of debate, a utilitarian debate over what is obviously beneficial to the only individuals you think matter. That surely is the frame of the discussion.
When I look at some of the technologies that have been talked about today, particularly sort of pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, embryo experimentation in general, and even down to sex-selective abortion, etc., whether we like it or not, that the same subjective criteria that Galton was talking about seem to be taken into account here. Maybe it's not on the basis of race, but it's still on the basis of personal preference. Are the technologies that we're talking about today, these are eugenic? Let's just deal with it. Let's just be honest. Whether we like it or whether we like the phrase eugenics or not, let's just be honest in terms of what they are.
My name's Rachel. I'm a student at sixth form. This is sort of for you. I'm sorry, I can't remember your name.
Ellie.
Okay, hello, sorry.
Hi.
It's about neo-paternalism, in that in your opening statements you were talking about how you believed that eugenics wasn't an accurate description anymore and that it was more neo-paternalism. And in that you seem to be supportive of the idea of neo-paternalism and the idea that you're not at all. Okay, well, sort of that aspect. But my question was more with regards to the suggestions or advice of doctors compared to eugenics, where eugenics is the literal changing of someone's body. Doctors are just giving people advice that they don't necessarily have to follow, and I was just wondering how you thought those were actually in the same way related.
My name is Yusuf. My question is, I see this argument as almost a parallel with the argument of artificial intelligence, and whether we have, whether we are working too quickly with coming up with new ideas and not coming up with solutions to possible problems. So my question is, what kind of regulation will exist or is being produced in order to make sure that technology like this doesn't go into the wrong hands for the wrong reasons, just like artificial intelligence maybe?
Hello, my name's Nikki. I'm a genetic counsellor based in Nottingham.
I suppose I'm just worried that we might be... I'm very for new technologies, but I think we might be getting a bit carried away. I mean, I personally find... in terms of somatic disease in people that are alive and kicking, CRISPR-Cas9 is fantastic, amazing, has real potential, and there's research and treatment going on now that may make some disease that we currently use reproductive technologies for. We may not need those if we can get effective treatment, so they're not such big issues. But in terms of what germline technology, the use of these technologies in the germline now, one, if you're using PGD, if it's for disease that is clearly genetic, where you just select the embryo without the disease, you don't need it. Two, if you're talking about complex disease, we don't understand it well enough, so we can't use it yet. Hopefully that'll come. Who knows, those diseases might be not so genetic as we might think. And in terms of traits, like intelligence or etc., or happiness and all these things that probably have a huge, social component and aren't really genetic at that level anyway, who knows the future. But CRISPR-Cas9 is fantastic now for people affected with all kinds of diseases.
Yep, that's a very important clarification. So CRISPR-Cas9 has applications not just for germline modification, which can't be done in treatment yet. It will have other applications in other types of treatment that are permissible. That's very important to clarify.
I was wondering if this technology will be available to everyone in the society, because only if some people can afford it, it can cause even larger gaps between groups of people. And also, how will you draw the line between what is a disease and what is not?
Hi, my question is about regulation. So it seems to me that if we're going to have this technology, we're going to need a lot of regulation, but the nature of this regulation will be society deciding what people should be able to choose with regards to the genes of their children. Now, if you have the state deciding what people should choose in their children based on wider societal good, isn't that really eugenics?
Hi, yes, I'm Timandra, as seen earlier on Big Data. I found this really useful discussion to distinguish between the kind of eugenic shadows that are brought in terms of certain medical technologies and eugenics as a political and social phenomenon. Unlike Sandy, I mainly come across the kind of history of eugenics in its relation to statistics and now data, and Galton was also a key person in the development of modern statistics and indeed some of his successors as well. And I think I tend to agree with most of the panel that the biological and medical techniques that are now available to alter human biology are not eugenic, in that then they're not at all linked with that political project. But I think some of the legacy of the statistical approach to society, the idea that you look at society in terms of populations and probabilities and predispositions and tendencies, and that you can predict outcomes for individuals based on what you've observed about how they fall into certain groups. I think that's only too alive and well, and if it's not about looking at people's DNA, it's often about looking at their postcode or their habits or their behaviour or their educational attainment or other aspects like that. So I think if we're going to be on our guard against a eugenic attitude to improving us with or without our consent, then actually we should keep more of an eye on the statistical and data approaches that predict our outcomes based on measurable attributes.
I'm going to ask the panel to do the impossible. I'm going to ask them to respond to whatever they want from what they've just heard and offer a closing thought, all in the space of a couple of minutes. And I'm going to do it in the reverse order to the order in which they spoke. So I'm going to start with you. You've been admirably concise up till now, Chris. So if anyone's allowed to overrun slightly now, it's you. So tell us what you think.
I think one of the questions sort of hit the nail on the head, that we can get too ahead of ourselves here. Sure. We really need to slow down, and we can talk about altering our intelligence and doing all these things, which will happen in the future. But what we really need to sort of focus on now is whether there is good reason to conduct this research. Now, in not just the scientific community, but in the community widely, there's this view that such techniques like gene editing are going to be bad, and we shouldn't even do the research. They call for a moratorium on all research doing it in human embryos. Now, I think although there are these really hard issues that we need to sort of go through about regulation, about what are we going to target, about how we're going to do it, we can solve these slowly through public consultation and through things like that. So I think
things like this.
Things like this, exactly. So I think we've got good reason to do the research, and I think although there are issues about using it, I think those issues are largely solvable.
Okay, Ganesh.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more actually. So picking up from Tamandra's point about data, I'm just going to try and summarise how I think about this. Science deals with data, right? That's not an absolute. When you go to your doctor and you get given medicine, they tell you that you're likely to get better on this. There's strong evidence to suggest that you will. And the same is sort of true of this stuff that we're talking about. You know, it's a lot of the things that we've touched upon here are things that are not actually possible at this point in time. The question is, do we even go there? Do we want to go there? Science is not about saying to parents, you must absolutely do this, else this, and this will happen, because it's not about absolutes. It's about the evidence suggests very strongly, blah, 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 whatever it is in each of these cases. And so, you know, just as with any other piece of evidence or advice given in life, you as an individual always have a choice as to whether or not you take it on board or you believe the evidence that you are provided with. And so the educational background of people sort of taking these things on board is very important. We need to talk about it. People need to be aware of how these things work. And the truth is, as far as I can see anyway, whether you call it eugenics or you call it something else, we are all engaged in activities surrounding improving ourselves, our families, our nearest and dearest, and our children. And whether we do that by moving to a different postcode so that we can get them into a good school, or whether we do that by deciding to believe that certain studies and certain scientific research has suggested that removing this or the other gene will probably reduce your child's likelihood of developing asthma or something far simpler than that in the future, is a choice that we would be making ourselves. And it's through the debates of individual people that we would get the consensus to get some sort of regulation put in place, I would hope. But yeah, it's to do with possibility and weighing that up with a bit of imagination and hope for where we want ourselves to go.
Leslie.
Yeah, somebody made an interesting point about economics and whether people can afford these things. And also, I'm thinking back to the 1930s, that the big kind of anxiety around the feeble-minded and sterilisation was in the context of economic depression, plus the growth of publicly funded provision for, you know, people with disabilities, and the idea that this was becoming an enormous burden and therefore something had to be done, and sterilisation was seen as a quick fix, you know, and would save money. So I'm you know, the whole lot of questions there about, you know, and also there's this idea that you're putting things back on the individual when perhaps they should be back on the community. Like Ganesh was just saying about you fix a child's genes to prevent asthma. Well, perhaps we should be thinking about the environmental conditions that cause children to get asthma in the first place and deal with that rather than the individual. But no, I could go on for a very long time.
Ellie will go on instead.
So I'll just try and clarify this point on neo-paternalism, because I've obviously been extremely confusing. I think that's the big problem. I think we live in a neo-paternalist age, and for me it's the single most important problem that we need to recognise and do something about. And but by that I mean that I think we live at a time where the moral autonomy of individuals is held in particularly low regard. I mean, some people think it's just a fiction. They don't even believe that there's any such thing, or think that in various ways it needs to be constrained. I mean, insofar as there is a kind of a theme that runs through modern history at least, and it's an interesting point that you made, Tamandra, is that I think the modern society has had a long-standing difficulty of accepting and embracing individual autonomy, and has expressed that difficulty in various ways. And I think 19th century and early 20th century determinisms was one way of rejecting claims for individual autonomy. So that's one way of thinking about biological determinism, but also statistical determinism. And you'd love this paper I talked about, the Thomas Leonard one, because that's really what he's talking about economics, because it's to do with statistics, not biology, but he's conceptualising that as a form of eugenic thinking. So I'm sure you'd be interested in that. Just to end on doctors, and this point about advice giving and its relation to moral autonomy. I mean, I think that, doctors are powerful. There is medical power. And what doctors say and the way they behave towards their patients. It's not just like me having a chat with my friend. I mean, it's a different social relation. And I think that ethics, in terms of the medical profession, has attempted at various points to understand that. I think, unfortunately, a lot of the time this is getting lost now. And I think that a lot of people involved in the health professions are really happy to go way too far and give advice when it's not asked for, say things to people that aren't based on reasonable information, and see themselves as health police, really, more than people trying to provide medical care. Now, I'm not saying this is true of all of the medical and health professions, but I think it is a pretty increasingly dominant way that things are, and I think it's a very important problem, particularly for pregnant women and mothers, to recognise and address.
I'd like to thank the Wellcome Trust for supporting the Strand, and I'd like to invite you to thank our excellent panel of speakers.